Welcome back to the London Futurist podcast. In my life so far, I've read literally hundreds of books about the future, yet none has had such a provocative title as this: The Future Loves You: How and Why We Should Abolish Death. That's the title of the book written by our guest in this episode, Ariel Zeleznikow-Johnston. Ariel is a neuroscientist and a research fellow at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. One of the key ideas in Ariel's book is that so long as your connectome, the full set of the synapses in your brain, continues to exist, then you continue to exist. Ariel also claims that brain preservation, the preservation of the connectome, long after we have stopped breathing, is already affordable enough to be provided to essentially everyone. These claims raise all kinds of questions, which we'll come to shortly. Ariel, welcome to the London Futurist podcast.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for joining us, Ariel.
Ariel, before we look at the ideas in your book, what should our listeners know about you and your background?
Okay. Yeah, as you mentioned, I'm a research fellow at Monash University. My day job is doing neuroscience of consciousness, trying to understand how it is that our brains give rise to our subjective experiences. My background before then, I did a PhD in behavioral neuroscience. So that was more cognitive science, looking at how genetics and environmental influences affect learning and memory in an animal model. And I guess I've been interested in neuroscience, technology, history, all of the things that I talk about in the book for a very long time, which is what inspired me to get interested in this space and write the book in the first place. Because what I am really fascinated by is how is it that our brains make us who we are? And with a good enough understanding of how that is, could we use that knowledge and technology that results from that knowledge in order to extend people's lives and give them a more healthy life?
So near the beginning of your book, you tell the story of the life of somebody called Elizabeth Hughes. That account set up a pattern for discussing the larger vision your book offers. So why don't we start the conversation by you retelling at least some of that narrative?
Sure. In 1919, Elizabeth, who was 11 years old at the time, developed what we would today call type 1 diabetes, or what was then called juvenile diabetes. Now, unlike today, where we have treatments, regular insulin injections, at the time, there was no knowledge of insulin and no treatment for juvenile diabetes. And the typical outcome for a patient diagnosed with diabetes was that they would die within 12 months or so. This was terrible, and Elizabeth's parents understandably wanted to avoid this scenario and went looking for anything they could possibly do to try and prolong their daughter's life. And while they didn't come across insulin, because it hadn't been discovered yet, they did come across a new treatment which was being trialed, which was starvation therapy. So the issue with diabetes is too much sugar in the blood. And one of the things that can help combat that is keeping blood sugar levels very low by eating minimal diets. And this clinic and the doctors working at the clinic had realized that if you kept someone just on the threshold of enough food, they could prolong a patient's life from a few months up to possibly several years. And so Elizabeth went to this clinic and survived 3 years in this starvation state. But because she did so, she lived long enough for insulin to be discovered and become available in 1921. And as a result, ended up living into her 70s in the end, after then taking regular insulin treatments. And I think what's so poignant about this story is it really makes clear the difference between being born or being alive just too soon for a new treatment and just late enough to be able to make use of it, and how an entire lifetime can separate those two. And also to highlight the fact that there's already been so much progress made in technologies capable of keeping people alive. And we should really keep a perspective on new things do become possible and available over time.
Before we get on to the defiance of death and the elimination of aging and so on, I'm fascinated by consciousness. David and I are both involved in a startup called Conscium, which is about trying to work out whether it is possible to create conscious machines and whether that would be a good idea. And you've studied this a lot. So one of the things that I'm still slightly confused about, and I think everybody is what exactly is consciousness? And one way of getting at it is to think about the difference between the term sentience and consciousness. How do you think about those two words?
I don't really like the term sentience because although consciousness is often a controversial and contentious term, I think sentience is actually even more used in different ways by different people. I think David Chalmers, one of the foremost consciousness philosophers, is on record as not using the term and not liking the term because he himself does not really know what it means. Sometimes people use it to mean conscious in the sense of has subjective experience. Sometimes people use sentience to just mean sensitive to an organism's surroundings, whether or not it has subjective consciousness. Sometimes people use it in other ways as well. So I try and avoid the term when I can, and when I see others use it, be like really careful about what exactly do they mean by sentience. When it comes to the term consciousness, that also people can mean different things by it, and we can get into that if you want. But I think the most commonly used definition amongst philosophers is that there feels like something to be that entity, that it has subjective experiences, it can taste or feel pain or see colors or feel its environment in some way. And technically, for those of you who are interested, that's often referred to as phenomenal consciousness. But this is very contentious, and there's so many different theories in this space. If you want to drill more into that, I'm happy to, but we could spend a whole episode just on that.
Just a little bit more. I wonder if there isn't actually quite a useful distinction. You mentioned that sentience could be, or some people use it to mean, sensitivity to the environment, i.e. having some sort of sensory experiences, having some qualia. And then consciousness could be a step beyond that, i.e. an awareness that there is a self. Not necessarily reflecting on that self, such that you'd be able to detect yourself in a mirror, but just having an awareness that there's a you and then there's other things in the world.
That is not quite the distinction that I think is most commonly used. When people say sentience in the sense of being able to in some way be sensitive to surroundings, I've seen that used by people like Carl Friston, who's a famous neuroscientist, and a few other philosophers who are interested in predictive coding or active inference, if you've ever heard of those ideas, not necessarily in a phenomenal consciousness sense. They will refer sometimes to sentience in bacteria or sentience in worms without necessarily committing themselves to saying those entities have qualia or like phenomenal experience, or it feels like something to be those entities. When we're talking about things like self-awareness, people normally say that is distinct from pure consciousness. You could imagine that maybe a jellyfish, for example, really does feel like something when it's drifting around, but it's not self-aware. It doesn't know that it itself exists. And that's some higher level of capacity again.
To be clear, this might sound like philosophical ramblings, but it's incredibly important. Because what you're proposing, Ariel, is that many people, like myself, or younger or older, might do something similar to what happened to Elizabeth. Her life was slowed down very significantly to await the availability of treatments for whatever may be killing us. But the question is, what would we be like at the end of that slowing down process? And in Elizabeth's case, it was fairly clear. She was, I think, conscious throughout. She was a person who could have memories throughout, and she identified as the same person. But the worry is that if somehow our lives were put in complete hold, not just like a general anesthetic, but in some deeper sense, we were frozen, either literally or metaphorically, and then maybe even recreated in a different substrate altogether. Maybe not in our original brains, but in a new brain, a new biological brain, or a silicon brain. Would that really be us? Would that be a future worth holding on to? And that's where some of these tricky arguments about consciousness might change people's lives here and now. Whether people feel they would like to commit to themselves and commit some money to this particular course of brain preservation, or whether they shrug their shoulders and say, no, that's not of interest. Is that a fair summary?
The one comment I would make is I just push back slightly on the idea that any of these proposed preservation methods are necessarily deeper in some sense than general anesthesia. only that I think people are often unaware of the fact that there's a procedure called deep hypothermic circulatory arrest that's already routinely used in surgery, where we cool people down to about 20 degrees. We see complete cessation of heart function, complete cessation of brain activity. It can be done for 45 minutes to 60 minutes with no consciousness. Then you can warm the patient back up and they seem to be cognitively intact. I don't think there's any level of unconsciousness deeper than that sort of procedure can provide. That's just an aside before we get into the weirder stuff of brain preservation. But I would push back on the idea that people are necessarily still somewhat conscious or something in general anesthesia, or that they have to have ongoing brain activity to survive.
Just before we move off of consciousness, we ought to mention that Carl Friston is an advisor to our company, so we're deeply interested in his active inference thinking. I didn't know that he says that bacteria can be sentient. That's quite interesting. I'll find out more about that.
So the discussion about whether one type of unconsciousness is deeper than another, it's unsatisfactory, as you point out. But I think we're struggling to get the right terms to make sense of our intuitions, our hopes and fears. To put my cards on the table, I'm reasonably confident that if I were cryopreserved, then my brain was reduced to the temperature minus 170, so there's almost no activity. And then, by some scientific miracle in the future, I could gradually be reanimated. I would feel reasonably confident that was still me, because it's sufficiently analogous to general anesthesia. But some of the scenarios you talk about in your book aren't so much cryopreservation, but chemopreservation or plastination, in which the brain's activity is changed in a different way and might end up with the brain being cut into very small slices and all the information from these slices being recreated in some different way. Part of me wants to say that's a different kind of reconstruction. I might not, as an individual self, survive that transformation, although I don't know what I can ground these intuitions in on a scientific basis.
I'm certainly sympathetic to the intuition. Certainly, it's very bizarre to imagine surviving through such a scenario, and much more comfortable to imagine surviving through the use of technologies much more analogous to how we naturally survive from day to day and year to year. But I think what we need to do is we need to really analyze how does survival work and what it is that makes us the same person today as we were 10 years ago and will be 10 years from now. Because I think the more we analyze it and the more we think about it, the more complicated the notion of exactly what it is that enables survival becomes known to us. So for example, it can't be just through the physical continuity of being made of the same material, because we eat and we breathe and we excrete and we change out our body mass roughly every year and a half. We change out the constituents of our brain, like the components that make up our synapses, on a weekly to monthly basis. So it's not the same physical material that's making us the same person. We could think that maybe it's the continuity of consciousness, like a continuous unbroken stream of consciousness. But we've already mentioned things like anesthesia, like deep hypothermic circulatory arrest surgery, even just sleep and mind blanking. We definitely think we survive through these periods of unconsciousness. So if it's not through physical material and it's not through a continuous stream of consciousness, then what we're left with is through the continuity of our memories, of our personality, of our goals and desires, our psychological traits. And it's these things that survive through breaks in consciousness and which are retained even when the physical material that provides their structure is changed out. Now, given that that's the case, I do think there's a promise in technologies which don't hold on to necessarily the same physical material, but which maintain someone's personal identity through maintaining their psychological properties. So aldehyde stabilized cryopreservation or chemopreservation, as you mention it. Because the idea is that in this circumstance, even though you've changed the medium, potentially, if you were to use it and use a revival method from this state, like uploading someone, the same essential way in which I survive from year to year, which is through the maintenance of these psychological properties, is still maintained, even though the physical medium has changed. Now, I know a lot of people have a lot of different intuitions about that, and I could just continue to elaborate, but you might have a specific intuition that's bothering you. So maybe we should hone in on that.
I love this discussion. I studied philosophy at university, and I have very happy memories of sitting in my tutor's study talking about science fiction worlds in order to tease out our intuitions about what personal identity actually means. He liked to concoct scenarios with beings that lived for millions of years and were totally different in year 999,000 than what they had been like in year 10, and were they still the same person, and beings which cloned themselves in order to reproduce. And was the daughter the same as the mother, or was it a different entity? It's quite easy to produce scenarios, thought experiments, intuition pumps, as Daniel Dennett called them, which destroy pretty much any theory you might have about what personal identity is. Imagine that you do upload your mind into a machine and you keep the original. So I stay alive, but there's a machine running around which is completely convinced that it's me. It has my memories, it has my behavioral traits. It is entirely confident and happy that there has been a continuation of its consciousness, what's all Kripke called a stepwise recoverability of consciousness. But the original me also thinks that I'm conscious. And if you say, right, now we've created the new you, we're going to kill the old you because it's surplus to requirements, I would strongly object to that. But if the new me didn't know about the old me, it wouldn't worry about that at all. It would have no problem whatsoever. And of course, you could have thousands of me's running around the world, because uploading means you could produce many, many copies. I suspect, and I've never managed to pin this down very well, but I suspect actually the whole notion of personal identity is incoherent. I think in the future, we're going to have to accept that it actually doesn't mean anything. And when I think about my own life, I'm quite old now, and when I think back to myself at 6 years old, I can sort of see that was me, but it wasn't me in many, many important ways. So I suspect the whole concept may be incoherent, and that may be one of the ways in which we get over fears of uploading.
I want to push back on that. I think that personal identity is a defensible position to hold. I think first what I should acknowledge, though, is I understand the intuition, the fear of, well, you've made a copy of me, but I'm still here and I don't want to die. And I think what's confusing is there's a distinction which people do not often think about that can be made between a single moment of conscious experience, of subjective experience, and the subject in that moment, and a person as they exist over time as an extended entity across time and space through which we are concerned with personal identity. Because the me in this moment will cease to exist in the moments to come, because this subjective experience that I have right now changes. And that's super obvious when I, for example, become unconscious, when I go to sleep or under anesthesia, those sorts of things. But normally I don't mourn the loss of my past moments of experience, because I'm still connected to those through memory, through the knowledge of I am continuous, and I'm not scared about my future selves because I know that I will continue to be connected to them through memory and shared goals and shared personality. That's what binds me naturally across time. What's so weird about these differences in this case where there's copies and one branch continues and the other branch doesn't, is because there is a real loss in those scenarios where there's moments of subjective experience where it becomes known that those are going to be lost from the future of that entity. Where after the branching point, if you're threatening to kill one of those entities, it's like, but my memories will never be encoded. These moments of experience do not continue on. And I think it's a little more analogous to if you gave me some amnestic drug and told me I was going to lose the next hour or 2 hours of conscious experience. In that circumstance, it's still a loss, and I'd be very upset by this idea of losing this experience, but it's not quite the same as dying, in the sense that the key things that make me continue onwards into the future. That's sort of more the intuition I have on reflection after thinking about these ideas for a while. That was an answer to one part. The second part you had was about
the incoherence of the concept of personal identity.
Oh, yeah. So I don't necessarily buy that. I think very much on the extremes, personal identity becomes a bit odd when we think about, is someone continuous in a sense of having the same psychological properties as the fetus from which they developed? That is more ambiguous, particularly if we're talking about time points before the brain has even developed. And you could take it to the extreme the other way. Is someone still the same as their decaying corpse at some point? These are issues that are discussed in philosophy of personal identity and can get very strange. But I think within a natural human lifespan, from 10 to 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. Psychological studies and surveys have showed that there's pretty strong consistency of personality traits. People can do surprisingly well at remembering events from their childhood and feeling identified still with those, the person who existed then. I think the intuitive notion we have that we are still the same holds true because to a large degree, we really do still have the same goals, desires. That's not to say there's not change, but if we compare how similar we are across time to how different we are from other people, I think we'll find that mostly we're much more similar to ourselves from different time points than we are to other people.
I suspect it may turn out to be a bit like the progress from Newtonian physics to Einsteinian physics. The concept of personal identity is very important to us, and we'll cling on to it like anything. Like most people still have some difficulty dealing with the idea that time and space is relative and so on. It's not hard, though, to come up with scenarios which test it to destruction. For instance, imagine somebody joining a cult and emerging as entirely the same person. They look the same. They've got some of the same behavioral characteristics. They get angry quickly or they don't get angry. But everything about the way that they view the world is totally changed. Are they the same person? It gets fuzzy there.
Yeah.
Another thought is how amazingly unconcerned we are about our future selves. We smoke, we drink too much, we eat too much. We show no empathy towards our future selves, which is a little odd. And then testing it to complete destruction. Imagine you upload a mind and you create 20 copies of it. You could say that they were all the same person to start with, and then at t plus 1 nanosecond, they all become different. Which one inherits the record collection and the cat and the wife?
Yeah.
It becomes, I think, untenable. And as I say, I think it might be like a transition from Newtonian physics to Einsteinian physics. And this is why I think we should all be science fiction readers, because science fiction is actually philosophy in fancy dress. It's really important.
I definitely agree with the science fiction reading recommendation. I think the core issue is people start reasonably, I think, with an intuition that they're the same person over time due to the continuous, unbroken stream of consciousness that connects one moment to the next moment to the next moment. And I think on reflection, that cannot possibly work. But that's the intuition, though, and that giving that up is a strange and unintuitive thing to do, despite the fact that on reflection, I think it's an indefensible position. What then I think is defensible, though, as you say, in a different paradigm, is the continuity of psychological traits, the continuity of memory and personality and these things. But if you accept that view, that psychological view of personal identity, you have to accept the fact that the line's a little blurry sometimes for exactly how much change can happen while still being the same person or not the same person. And the fact that you can have potentially, if it turns out that you can make multiple instances of the same brain, you might have odd scenarios where legitimately there are many entities claiming to be the same person. But despite that being weird, I don't think that disproves the coherence of the notion of personal identity. It's just not the same as our initial view of an unbroken stream of consciousness that can only be singular.
So we've dived fairly deeply into many of the arguments in the second part of your book, where you explore these different theories of the brain, the mind, consciousness, memories, identity at some depth. But we might have left some of our listeners a bit anxious because we haven't talked much about the why. And in fact, I did get some feedback from a listener to one of our previous episodes. She had listened to our episode with Jordan Sparks, where he also talked about brain preservation. And she said it was interesting, but why? What's the reason for trying to consider such a future? Maybe I could push that back. Why is all this conversation important, and why should people pay attention to it?
I think the key reason why we should be attending to this is because people want to live longer lives and healthier lives than they are currently on track to get. If you survey people on how long they'd like to live without providing them any additional information, typically people say about 10 years longer than statistically their demographic is likely to get. So a typical person might say, in a country like the UK, about 90 years. But as soon as you say, what if I could guarantee you good physical and mental health? Then many of them jump straight to saying, at least 120 years, if not even an indefinite period of time. So we know that people would like to live longer than they're currently able to. And what's more harrowing is if you actually go and you survey the terminally ill, people in hospices on their deathbed, and you ask them as they're dying, what is your will to live? These individuals typically still report very strong will to live. I think it's something like 70% of these patients still describe a strong will to live. So on the basis of this, we realize that people want to live longer lives than they're currently able to. In one sense, that's almost blindingly obvious. That's why we have medicine. That's why we have healthcare. That's why we have medical research. We want to continue improving the quality and quantity of people's lives. But those are inherently limited. Our medicine is still young and imperfect, and there's many developments that are still required before we can enable people to live as long and healthy lives as they would like to. So we have to get a little bit more creative about what other possible methods we could use. In the same way that Elizabeth needed to use starvation therapy to make it to when insulin was developed, I and others think that maybe preservation is something that can be used to buy people more time until other methods of reviving individuals and restoring them to health become available. But the key point is we want to provide people the more life that they clearly, in many cases, want, even if on a day-to-day basis they don't reflect on the fact that when their end times come, that is something that they would want.
David mentioned Jordan Sparks, who runs Oregon Brain Preservation in Salem, Oregon. When we had him on the show, I was completely stunned by his revelation that he will plastinate your brain for free. So you can go along to Salem, and if you conveniently die, he will then remove your brain from the body, preserve it in exactly the same way that brains are preserved for medical research purposes, which he also does, and it's why he's able to do it for free. And he believes that those brains are preserved in a way that keep the connectome in good order. The connectome being effectively the wiring diagram for the brain, the blueprint for the brain. And that in some future time, the technology will exist to be able to slice those brains up into tiny, very, very thin slices and recreate the connectome in a computer. And that will, once you get it going, do braining. That will do what brains do, and brains create minds. So you will be reborn inside the computer. Now, a lot of people would think that's technologically never going to happen. Some people would think that philosophically it doesn't preserve you. But if you do think that both of those things are wrong, that you could survive it, it's very, very compelling. And amazingly, it's free. Does that excite you? Are you going to do that?
I hope I won't need to do that for some time, but it's certainly a possibility I would consider if I were to receive some bad news in the near term. But more seriously, I think techniques that use fixation protocols are promising because they really do have the promise at holding on to people's personal identity through preserving their brain structures. And I agree that it's exciting that on reflection and analysis, this doesn't really necessarily need to be a very expensive procedure. To give some context, we are actually, as a society, willing to spend quite a lot of money on treatments that we think have a reasonable chance of extending people's lives. Health economists talk about this in the sense of quality-adjusted life years and willingness to pay to give someone an additional extra year of healthy living. I think in the UK, it's something like £40,000 that people are willing to spend per quality-adjusted life year. I go through the details in one of the last chapters in the book. But some context for the sorts of procedures that we're willing to pay for already are things like heart transplants, which can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars per procedure, or things like CAR T-cell therapy. New, very fancy cancer therapy can cost something like $1 million per procedure or so. But we don't want to spend that much money if we don't have to. We'd ideally like to spend as little money as possible to give people as much life as possible. And chemopreservation, the reason why it doesn't need to be that expensive is because it's fundamentally not a very complicated procedure. The idea is that you connect up to someone's vasculature, you wash out their blood, you pump them full of the preservative fluids. The fluids themselves are close to being the same as industrial chemicals that are produced in bulk already. And once that's done, maybe you can get away with not even using cold temperatures at all. I know that Jordan Sparks and his chief scientist, Andrew Mackenzie, are very excited by that proposal. But maybe you also have to cool the body down to prevent any sort of final movement of biomolecules. Things like fatty molecules, lipids, maybe still move around in these chemically preserved bodies. And so it might be better to cool the bodies down somewhat to prevent that for good preservation quality. But yeah, there's no fundamental reason why these things should be expensive in the same way that bespoke genetic engineering of someone's immune system is, or surgeries that require a huge number of professionals in a very sterile room with very specialized training and equipment. Preservation fundamentally, I think an estimate that I put in the book for the costs, including the cooling procedure, if done at scale, would be maybe something like $10,000 per procedure and maybe a few $100 to $1,000 in storage costs per year. The problem at the moment with the expense is just that we're not doing it as a society, so we don't have the scale to do it cheaply. But it should be possible to do it cheaply.
So that's much less expensive than people who sign up for standard cryopreservation have to set aside, which can be up to $200,000 for a whole body preservation, or a bit less for just preserving the brain or the head. So that would be one reason to prefer fixation. But are there scientific reasons to prefer what you've suggested compared to the traditional cryonics route?
Yeah, I think there are. I understand the intuition. People would prefer a method that they think is potentially more akin to a hypothermic state from which they can be biologically revived into. Although I would dispute whether there's good guarantees that cryopreservation without fixation has a higher probability of ensuring that than cryopreservation with fixation. But even putting that aside, the issue with cryopreservation protocols that existing cryonics organizations make use of and have published data about is that they do substantial damage to a patient's brain. If you look at a brain that is cryopreserved without fixation, what has been shown previously is that you get something like the brain shrinks in volume by 50% due to dehydration. Essentially, the cryoprotectants pull water out of the brain in a way that shrinks it down. And if you look under a microscope at the tissue taken from these brains, it's not obvious that this tissue has been preserved in a way that will allow all the synaptic connections to be confirmed to still be intact. In contrast to these chemical fixation protocols, where this sort of work has been done and has been published in journals, where you can see under an electron microscope, it looks essentially the same as what's otherwise published in non-preservation neuroscience journals, and arguably almost identical to what we would expect natural brain states to look like. And I think we really should be focusing on preservation quality first and foremost over potential theoretical biological revivability, because it's preservation quality that can guarantee the memory still being in there, personality still being there, all these sorts of things. What would be great is that if people thought that these other preservation protocols were sufficient to hold onto someone's connectome, all of someone's synapses, everything that makes them them, that they were able to also rigorously show that with studies of electron microscopy of this sort of brain tissue. And I know there are some groups who are claiming that that's what they're planning to do. I would love to see that work come out. But so far, it hasn't been done.
What do your neuroscience colleagues in academia think about your ideas? Do they roll their eyes when you come up, or are they curious?
That's a great question. Informally, I know that there's a lot of people who are sympathetic to this quietly, who think that the evolution of neuroscience, our increased ability to have greater and greater understanding of how the structures of the brain control and provide our behaviors, they look at past progress in neuroscience and they extrapolate forward and they think, oh, it seems pretty likely that something like uploading, emulation, these sorts of technologies should one day be possible. And indeed, for example, very recently, there's been the publication of the connectome of a fly brain and some work showing that a weak version of an emulation of a fly brain can recapitulate some of the feeding behaviors of that fly brain. That's informally, though. And there's people who quietly say, yeah, I think something like this could work. But there's also people who quietly or not so quietly say, this is complete science fiction. I don't think anything like this would ever work. So we wanted to move from informal to actually formally asking them. That's actually what I've been doing recently. I've just recently run a survey of neuroscientists where we got a few hundred responses from neuroscientists sampled from people who attended a particular conference as to what they thought about the possibility of memories being able to be extracted from brains preserved with aldehyde-stabilized chemopreservation, or whether it would ever be possible to create a whole brain emulation of a human brain preserved in this way, and a few related questions. What I found from the survey data, which I hope to upload soon, is that indeed there is a lot of variance in the neuroscience community. Some people who say no chance and some people who say definitely it'll work. But the median estimate for probability of something like aldehyde-stabilized cryopreservation being able to hold on to memories, and the median estimate that we will be able to one day emulate, or less formally upload, such a preserved brain, was about 45% probability. As in, the median probability people gave of that being possible was 45%.
At some unspecified time in the future.
That's right. But from a brain preserved using existing current technologies. Now, that's a lot less than the community saying 100% chance, but it's a lot more substantial than almost everyone saying there's no chance it'll work. It means that there's a substantial amount of support for these ideas and taking these ideas seriously.
So you're coming to the UK, I understand, and people will have a chance if they listen to this podcast and they think, oh, that was interesting, they have a chance to attend one of your talks in the UK. Can you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, so I will be in the UK. I think there's some events in the last week of November and first week of December. I think I'm giving a talk at the Royal Institution, I believe on the 2nd of December, but I'd recommend your listeners check for themselves that I've gotten that date right. I know I'll also be giving a talk in Edinburgh at one point, at the Hay Winter Festival at one point, and I think one other talk in London at some point. So there'll be several opportunities if they want to come ask me questions in person.
Some of this was arranged by your publishing company. Callum and I are a bit envious of people who manage to get book publishers to do that kind of work, because we've both written books which we feel are worth reading, but somehow they haven't had as big an impact on the world as maybe they should. So do you have any tips for getting a good book publisher on board?
It is harrowing as a process, and also there's a lot of luck involved. I spent a lot of time before I got my publication deal scrolling through, I think it's PubTips subreddit, for example, looking at all the stories of people succeeding, not succeeding, tips they were giving, methods that they'd used. I don't think, unfortunately, I have anything more substantial than you've got to really accept the fact that you're going to get rejected by a lot of people on the path to getting something published. Even if you have a good manuscript, there's still a good chance people won't see it as being a good fit for them or their publishing house or a particular agent. Even if you're an excellent writer, a lot of good luck and a lot of just keeping at it. And it's not a very fair or pleasant experience to go through.
I've now been published in all the three major ways. I was published by a mainstream publishing house, Penguin Random House. I was published by an academic publisher, and I've been self-published. And they've all got their pros and cons. If you self-publish, you are in control of the timing, of your content completely. You get to choose your own book cover, which you rarely do if you're published by somebody else. And quite often, if you're published by a mainstream publisher, they won't even let you choose the title. And they will take a year or so to get the book out. What the mainstream publisher can do is get you into bookshops and to get you reviewed by the mainstream media, who typically still won't review self-published books. But unless you're J.K. Rowling or Noel Harari, you have to do the marketing yourself, whichever route you go. And my best-selling books were self-published. So it can be worth doing it yourself. It's a lot easier to do it yourself, but you won't get reviewed by the mainstream media, and it's hard to get in the bookshops.
Yeah. In this circumstance, what I really wanted to do was to bring these ideas, which are often discussed on your podcast amongst people who are futurist inclined, to have this conversation take place not amongst this community of people who I think are already quite reasonably open-minded, but amongst a broader community of people who don't often really look towards what the future is likely to bring. And that's where I think traditional publishing can be of some use.
Absolutely. And I think it's fascinating what you're doing. And I'm really impressed by this result that 45% of presumably a cross-section of neuroscientists, not just people who are, as you put it, futurist friendly, think that at some point, brains which are being preserved today could be revived, or the minds that they host could be revived. That's really a remarkable finding. And I bet 5 years ago, it would have been a lot less.
The other thing you're doing in your book, Ariel, is telling more stories like that of Elizabeth Hughes. These are very accessible. People don't need to be experts in neuroscience to make sense of them. On the contrary, they are very engaging. Some of them are real-life stories. Some of them are composites of different real-life people mixed together. Some of them are science fiction, let's use that term, but they're credible science fiction. So I want to congratulate you on making this accessible, but also having the philosophical rigor in the middle of your book and some of the technical details at the end of your book that may convince readers that this is something that could be done, and probably this is something that should be done. So thanks very much for taking the time to do all that and to offer your thoughts on this episode of the London Futurist podcast.
Thanks very much. It's been a pleasure to speak to you both, and thanks for the kind words about the book.
Thanks for joining us, Ariel.